Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Richmond Wong, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, where I research how technologists address ethical issues in their work and how design methods can help researchers proactively surface issues related to ethics, privacy, and security. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our discussion today, The New Horizon for Data Rights, New Perspectives on Privacy, Security, and the Public Good. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Professor Naranchania. Tejas Naranchania is the Robert and Nancy Corson Assistant Professor of Law at the UC Berkeley School of Law, where he writes about and teaches courses on telecommunications regulation and intellectual property, among other subjects. He is also a faculty director at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. So Tejas, over to you.
Thanks, Richmond, and thanks to the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity for putting together today's great event. So I have the honor of introducing and moderating a conversation among our two panelists, Professor Mary Fan and Professor Karen Levy. Now, I'm going to ask them in just a moment to take a couple minutes each to tell us a little bit about themselves, their background, their current work, and what has led them to the questions that they're working on now. But I should definitely take a minute first to introduce each of them. So Professor Mary Fan holds the Jack R. McDonald Endowed Chair in Law at the University of Washington. And her work is informed by her prior experiences, both as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of California, and as an associate legal officer at United Nations International Criminal Tribunal. Professor Levy is an assistant professor in the Department of Information Science at Cornell and at Cornell University and associate faculty at Cornell Law School. And her research considers the legal, social, ethical dimensions of data-intensive technologies. She has a PhD in sociology from Princeton and a JD from Indiana University Moore School of Law. So I'm going to turn it over to Mary first to give us a little bit of background, and then to Karen.
Well, thanks so much, Tejas, for that lovely introduction and illuminating comments on a prior draft of the work I'm going to talk about today, and to Ann Cleveland and Steve Weaver for their leadership in community building across disciplines, and to Rachel and Matthew for your expertise and excellent planning on making everything run so well. So I'll just give you a brief overview of this piece that I've been working on, in part because inspired by the work at the center. It's forthcoming in the NYU Law Review, and it frames a right of the public to benefit from our privately held consumer big data. We contribute data to a massive growing pool every time we use the internet or the Internet of Things, pulled together, processed using advanced analytics. The information could be powerfully deployed, not just for private profit, but also public benefit, such as predicting and preventing disease, understanding the spread of information, if that data is accessible for use. And so my piece basically draws on insights from property theory, regulatory advances, open innovation, introduces a model that permits controlled access and use of our pooled consumer big data for public interest purposes while protecting against privacy and related harms. Happy to share more, but I also don't want to take up too much time and turn it over to my co-panelist.
Hi, I'm really happy to be joining you today. I'm Karen Levy. It's an honor to get to share a stage, to the extent this is a stage with Mary, whose work I have gotten a lot of inspiration from and really have a whole lot of respect for. So thanks for having me today. I am, as Tejas said, a sociologist by training. And so I get really excited about kind of the messiness of social life and how it intersects with the legal rights in privacy and in other rights that relate to technology use. And then how those kind of intersect or are complicated by the way people relate to one another, the way people hold power over one another, both in terms of institutions and organizations, and just in terms of really day-to-day, almost quotidian relationships between people. And so that's really characterized a lot of my work. I think later on I'll talk more about the specific piece that I think is bringing me here today, but all of my work kind of follows that thread, tries to pull on different ways in which kind of that messiness complicates our rights and privacy.
So that's a great way to jump into my first question, because it's about the sort of the messiness of the social interactions and the data that we generate from, I guess, what has been our primary mode of social interaction for the last 14 months or so, which is online. And I think a lot of us tend to think about privacy and data from a largely individual perspective, especially in the US. Mary, your work alludes to that. Sort of how individuals can or cannot protect or control your own personal data. But both of your work, both of your papers in very importantly different ways, broaden that perspective beyond individual control to sort of the data in society and data as an artifact of social relationships. And so I guess one question is why you think it's important to focus on these sorts of, they're almost externalities of social relationships and externalities of the data generated from social relationships. Why should we do that? And what are some of the key insights that we might get from doing that? Mary, you, I think, tend to focus on the positive externalities of some of this data. Karen, you're focused on the negative externalities. So I hope that there's some interesting contrast between what the two of you have to say. But Karen, I'll start with you.
Okay, I'll try not to be too much of a downer before Mary steps in. But I think the way you characterized it is really exactly right? There's been a lot of really useful and interesting, I think, theoretical work, legal theory work about, how we, as you said, tend to see privacy as a sort of individualistic right. But in fact, there's many huge societal values to privacy. We all do better in a society that has privacy. Privacy supports, all kinds of really important modes of human development, modes of, establishing democracy, right? We should all care about each other's privacy just, from at the baseline, right? Because it helps to establish a more healthy society, even if we're not directly implicated. So it's a common concern, yet this isn't really how the law views it, right? The law tends to be quite individualistic in its treatment of privacy, right? The notice and consent model as the dominant kind of mode of regulating privacy in the United States, really has at its core the idea that there is a person on one side of a relationship who's, the notice and consent model has been critiqued, widely for lots of different reasons. But one important reason for critiquing it is that, it sort of posits this individual end user. But in fact, we know that there is no end user, right? The end user is a network of different related people. The people who make decisions about what data are transmitted are often, stand in different power relationships to the people around them. So like a concrete example is maybe useful, right? Like there's a bunch of interesting work in information science about smart home devices, right? And who it is that gets to make decisions about, whether a smart home device is in the home at all, right? Like whether you have a webcam, whether you have a smart doorbell, and then what the privacy settings are going to be, right? Because that obviously implicates a lot of people other than the homeowner, but it tends to be the more powerful person, or the person with financial control in a household who gets to make those choices. So if we think about kind of where the harms may accrue, and I think as Mary will talk about, right, where the benefits might accrue, it's not just individuals, right? There are much broader kind of dynamics at play, and that's not really a good fit for how we've traditionally thought about the way that the law functions.
Thank you. I have some follow-up questions on that, but I'll let Mary go first.
Okay.
Sure. So Karen has produced really important insights in this area, and I guess I'll offer a complementary perspective, I think. So yeah, as Karen says, the individual privacy protection framework, it's intuitively alluring. Sure, I want more control over my personal information, and that's the predominant lens of regulatory advances and proposals that we see today. But my work is trying to argue that our control over our individual data points does not address, it misses the larger overarching question about who gets to use and benefit from the valuable amassed information about us, which is currently often held and protected under copyright law and trade secret law by private companies. So this individual data point, it's just a molecule in the sea of what is valuable, powerful, as well as potentially dangerous and beneficial about the pooled data points. And so the power of information is not from our individual single data point that we intuitively care very deeply about because it's ours, but from that amassed information. And so I just want to, so I think what I'm trying to do in my work currently is just talking about what the individual privacy paradigm misses, and how you can get unintended adverse consequences when you have this predominant individual privacy lens and you miss the ocean of value in terms of the community's interest or the collectivity's interest in this pooled data.
And Mary, what's interesting, Mary, about I think the way you just did it is that you've actually I started out asking questions about the externalities of the data, and the sort of the positive and the negative externalities of the data that is collected by various largely online entities. But I think, Mary, what you've done is, rather than sort of say there's potential positive externalities of the information, I think the way you framed your response, which I think is interesting, and I want to come back to, is that there are negative implications or negative consequences that flow from the prevailing mode of individual control. And that's one place where while you're focused on the value that we miss from all this information, and Karen, I think your privacy dependencies paper focuses on, some of the harms that we are not cognizant of in a particular moment of exercising individual control. These are both sort of the negative consequences of the prevailing model of data control, the sort of individual control model. But maybe, Karen, I should start with, so I alluded to privacy dependencies and these negative externalities. I keep coming back to that term because that's the term that I use. It's the way I speak. But you use a slightly different term, which is privacy dependencies. So maybe you can spend a little bit of time telling us what you mean by privacy dependencies, and maybe you can tell me if you think of them as different from externalities at all. That would be helpful. That would just be helpful for me.
Yeah, I'm happy to. So this paper that Tejas is alluding to is this paper that I wrote with my colleague Solon Barocas called Privacy Dependencies, that was published last year in the Washington Law Review, University of Washington Law Review. I always get them confused. But Mary, you know which one it is. So the paper is called Privacy Dependencies, and it refers, perhaps not surprisingly, to the idea that people's privacy depends on other people, right? On the decisions and the disclosures that other people make, which is somewhat intuitive, right? But we wrote the paper because, we wrote the paper for a few reasons. One of the primary reasons we wrote the paper is that even though we can sort of intuitively, posit that, if Mary knows my secret and she tells Tejas the secret, then Mary is in control of my private information, right? There are some really intuitive situations like that, but there are a lot of other situations that are far less intuitive, but actually quite common, right? And that unfold in all of these really interesting ways, often augmented by digital platforms, right? Or new technologies, right? So, and I think one of the most interesting ones is that what we do and say can reveal a lot about other people, even when what we are sharing is ostensibly only about us, right? This is one of the major points we try to make in the paper. So maybe let me explain it in a little bit of detail. So we kind of try to formalize and detail a bunch of different ways this happens. Some of these are premised on our social ties to one another, right? So I may pass on, right, as I said, Mary may pass on information about me that she knows because I told her in confidence. But this happens in plenty of other ways, right? I pass on a list of my LinkedIn contacts or my phone contacts to LinkedIn, right? Maybe unwittingly, right? I pass that information on. I post a picture of my daughter to Instagram, right? That's me passing my daughter's data in a sense, if we think about that as my daughter's data. I install the smart home device. I submit my genetic material to a genealogy website, right? That implicates the privacy of all my relatives, right? We see these things popping up all over the place. And then in other situations, it's more subtle because these dependencies can be based on are similarities or differences from people who we actually don't know at all, right? So it's not about my relationship with Mary or my relationship with my uncle. It's about, just some other person out there. So for example, right, like there's a bunch of, social science research showing that there's a lot we can infer about people, even when they take steps to protect sensitive data, right? So we can infer with a high degree of accuracy what someone's sexual identity is, for example, right? Based on the sexual identities of their friends who have revealed that information, right? Or we can make generalizations about, what I'm likely to buy based on what other people of my age and socioeconomic, group are likely to buy, right? So these are somewhat intuitive, but I think underappreciated when we think about privacy, because oftentimes that provides, this sort of route around thinking about consent, right? You no longer need my consent if you can basically, with a high degree of accuracy, infer this sensitive information about me anyway. So this pops up all over the place in different configurations. And in the work, we try to kind of map out all these different places it plays out. And it raises these important open questions, which I think Mary is addressing in her work about, if we accept that this is kind of everywhere, how do we deal with it, right? How do we want to regulate differently if we acknowledge that the individualistic model doesn't take us where we need to go? And I think actually to your point, Tejas, about externalities, there's a lot of inspiration to be taken from like environmental law, from thinking about joint property, from thinking about other contexts in which we think about this sort of diffusion of harms, right, across multiple parties. But I'll stop talking there because I feel like I could blather about this forever, but I'd much rather have a conversation about Mary's work too.
No, that's interesting. The very last point is just so, the way, as I was reading your paper, the first thing that sort of came to my mind was sort of thinking about data pollution. And I think there are other papers out there that sort of think about data as sort of pollutive, and that especially in the context of the Golden State Killer and DNA and these genealogical studies and sort of how the tree grows. I have lots of questions that I could keep asking you, but I should also give Mary a chance to tell us a little bit about her paper. So, Mary, your paper says things, and you've alluded to this already, that sensitive data can be used for big public interest purposes, right? Epidemiological studies, and that there are ways that we can draw from existing protocols without trampling on individual privacy. Maybe you could say a little bit more about what you think some of those goods are, and what you think the dangers are of our existing privacy laws and structures, norms, on that potential, and sort of how maybe you would change that.
Sure. So there are a lot of important questions that we need access to privately controlled data to answer. And just throwing out some ideas, for example, how do data information flows influence the rise of violent extremism, domestic terrorism, for example? How do internet bots and trolls spread viral patterns of misinformation, potentially even influence vital decisions such as presidential elections, COVID-19 vaccine refusal? How might our data be used to filter, funnel, perhaps even, as some lawsuits are now alleging, discriminate in the provision of information, services, opportunities, advertisements, special deals, even the prices that we get for our goods? So I think at stake what we have here is, the externalities, as you said, about this data flow. We're experiencing it. And the question is, how do we also partake in the benefits of this data? These externalities, they're out there, and so we're bearing it as consumers. How do we also share in its benefits? And that's kind of the question that I'm interested in. And I come from this question from my background, 3 different clusters of backgrounds. One is a former federal prosecutor, as you mentioned, and I know from my experience that big government, as Dan Sullivan and others have written, Big Brother doesn't have all the information or even the means of expertise of harnessing that information that private actors do today. And also just from my work collaborating in law and epidemiology, and then with misinformation studies. So there's this great data, there's these questions that we want to answer if we had access to the data. But the problem is we're seeing these well-intentioned laws strongly shaped by an individual privacy focus that's overlooking and potentially worse, impeding public interest uses of this pooled personal data. And I use as a prime example the European Union's General Data Privacy Regulation, the GDPR's provisions on data user rights and data controller obligations. They have it as primary paradigm commercial use of consumer data, but it's also sending alarm waves about impeding life-saving, potentially biomedical and health research. And so you've seen consternation arising because of this. And also, it's also even if private companies want to share their data. So for example, Facebook may want to share their data with Social Science One, but the threat of multi-million-dollar sanctions is a major deterrent to sharing important information. And even when information is shared, as ultimately Facebook, to take that example, recently released one of the largest social science databases ever assembled. So researchers were super excited about accessing this data, but ultimately to comply with these regulations that don't adequately distinguish between public interest uses versus private profit making. Ultimately, the data is obscured using differential privacy techniques, introduction of noise and censoring, techniques that basically render this information, the ability to draw research conclusions, difficult, complicated, problematic, potentially impossible when it comes to smaller group sizes. And so fundamentally, there needs to be a distinction and an understanding that this data has a public resource nature to it.
Thank you. So I want to take a second and try to turn us a bit from theory to policy. So if you could, if you had control of President Biden's desk for a minute, and you could draft an executive order and have him sign it, or you could get Congress to pass something. What would it be, right? What, Mary, would you want Congress or the administration to do to make sure that we harness the value from all this data that is sitting underused? Or Karen, what would you have Congress or the president do to mitigate the risks of, this individual control, the lack of the exercise of individual control with, in a way that is sort of conscious of and respectful of the rest of the community? What's the next step for policymakers? Mary, why don't you go first?
Sure, and I'll try to be brief because that was a little bit long just now, because I get excited about this stuff. For something new, basically I'd love to see recognition that this pooled consumer big data that we generated in the digital economy, it has this public resource nature to it, and the public should enjoy rights of what I've called controlled access and benefit. It's not, a free-for-all, but it's controlled access and benefit from this public resource. Karen.
Yeah, it's always hard to have the rubber meet the road and say, okay, you've written this paper, like now what? What's the point? And I think the most important point for policymakers to take seriously in policymaking on these topics is to consider, to recognize how intertwined our fates are, right? Like with privacy and with so much else, right? And to better sort of understand the impact of regulation in this area on social solidarity and on trust, right? So like one really, what I think would be the wrong approach, right, would be to say, okay, well, we now recognize that, our privacy is all dependent on each other's choices. And therefore, we're just going to double down on notice and consent and say, okay, now, Mary, when you decide to reveal when you sign a privacy policy, you need to think about not only Mary, but also Karen, whose data may be implicated here, right? Or, you could imagine that would be one response, is to sort of, responsibilize the who we think of as the end user for everyone else. And I think that would be a bad decision, knowing all the stuff we know about how difficult it is for people to kind of regulate their own privacy choices around only themselves, right? When they're only sort of charged with thinking about themselves. So I think we should take seriously kind of thinking about where the burdens are going to lie with this kind of decision-making, and thinking about whether that's the appropriate balance. And one place where I think we might be able to take some inspiration is just by breaking out of this idea of the end user, right? Like one place where I find a little bit of inspiration in this is in research ethics, right? So in research ethics, if I go do a study, right, and I go to my IRB and I say, I'm going to interview these 20 people. The common rule, which is like the federal regulation that governs academic research, right, says like that there are users, right, that they're my research participants, but then there is also this class of like secondary participants, right? I think they maybe just call them secondary participants, right? So if I'm asking questions about someone's dad, someone's dad who I didn't directly interact with is still somebody that my IRB is supposed to take into account when deciding if I can do this study, right? And that feels to me like a model for starting to approach some of these dependencies problems, in the right way, in a way that doesn't place all the onus on kind of this party that's stuck in the middle.
I have more questions about the policy remedies, and I'm gonna hang on to those because we're starting to get questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure that we have time for those at the end. But I do have two more questions that I want to make sure we get to. That again, sort of, I think, return us to theory and or even a step up from the papers and the conversation we've been having so far. So you're both data and privacy scholars, but I think something that I've certainly seen in my own work, and I think that lots of people see, is that not questions that we think of as new are often just iterations of questions that have persisted for a very long time. And I think that the questions that both of you are addressing here are, I don't mean to say that they're not new. I think they're new and interesting and novel, but they're also, they relate to some fundamental questions that we've been grappling with before. I think as I reread Mary, your paper, and Karen, as I read your paper, one thing that came to mind for me was, in particular, was Albert Hirschman's old book on exit, voice, and loyalty, because I was thinking about, sort of, how much control do I have over my ability to enter into certain relationships? Right? This idea that the dependencies among privacy mean that sometimes I have no control over my ability to even enter into the relationship to begin with. But it also means that I have less control over my ability to exit from the relationship. And it also means that my voice in the sort of management and control of that relationship is greatly diminished. So these questions of entry, exit, voice, sort of classical liberal questions, lowercase l liberal questions, are implicated in your work. So that's the reflection that I had just through reading the papers. I'm interested to hear what has come up for you as you've surely spent hours and hours and weeks and months laboring through the papers. What are we learning? What's old that is reflected here, and what is new here that I think should reflect on some of these old questions that we've been grappling with for a long time? Karen.
I love Hirschman, and I love that you bring that up. I mean, I think I have like a very unsatisfying take on it, which is that, to my students, it's unsatisfying, right? Because I completely agree that the stuff is not actually all that new. It's like old wine in new bottles, right? Social life has been messy for a long time. People have kept secrets for a long time, right? Like the scale and the nature of the information being shared is obviously different, right? So that, we could say that that's a qualitative shift from where things were 20, 25 years ago, and that matters. But I think ultimately, and I'm far from the first person to make this point, like it underscores the fact that tech policy is not really tech policy, right? Tech policy is family policy and economic policy and workplace policy, right? It's just a route into these bigger, broader, and really ultimately intractable questions, right? Which is not to say there's no progress to be made here, but I think anybody who tries to pitch, this is, my general response to anyone who tries to say that any tech policy question is easy or has an obvious answer is that they're fooling themselves or that they're trying to fool you, right? Like these are always going to be messy balancing acts. And maybe the one thing to kind of to take from that, right, like the positive thing to take from that is that we should be sure to try to account in our policymaking for preferences that are going to change over time, right? Or preferences that are going to diverge, right? So if we share some piece of data or share some interest in a piece of data and our preferences are different, right? Or my preferences change because, we're married and then we're not married or something, right? Like those are things that happen a lot. And I think we're just starting to reckon with the necessity of allowing for people's privacy preferences to change, right? And to change in important ways because they're so deeply embedded in social life, which is so messy and complicated.
Yeah,
Mary?
okay, this is a great question. I mean, it's funny, right? Because human civilization is so long, and being a scholar, it's such an odd thing that we have to like claim, make these claims when really, I think fundamentally, I mean, for centuries, we've often been grappling with the same deep, big questions, right? And so, and it just takes new configurations as our lives and our culture and technology changes. But there are fundamental big questions that our mind tends to grapple with. And one of them, I think, for me and in this work at least, is just, how do we, the individual versus the community, how do we protect and define the community, and how do we have community safety, our shared interests, and also, like, how do we deal with, this is a maybe peculiarly American question or preoccupation, this, like, we already have this really powerful cultural individualism. I grew up in Arizona. I'm like the ultimate libertarian individual, I'm steeped in that. And I think technology accelerates it somewhat, and the way we're living our lives today, we cultivate, we present, we focus on ourselves and how we portray ourselves. And I want to control the information because that's how I control my image. And so I think it actually accelerates some of the tendencies that we've long observed in our culture. And I think, and I think it's, so what are we grappling with? The big questions that we've grappled with for centuries as humans, like, what are our shared collective interests? How do we define the collective interests? What is the collectivity? How is it manufactured? And the role of the individual versus the group.
So that's a really good question. The question that you posed at the end is a really good one, and I think resonates with what Karen said. So I'm going to go off script a little bit. I want to ask you both a question that's exactly about that, which is sort of how do we define the shared preferences, right? Or how do we define shared preferences in the face of diffuse preferences across the relevant community or society? And so it's a basic institutional design question. So it's either, it's a version of the last two questions, which is, we've been dealing with a lot of this over a long period of time. We've been dealing with institutional design questions for a very long time, right, down to the basic choice of how we form our government. Or also this sort of policy question of what do we want policymakers to do about this? So I guess the more specific question I have for you is, how do you design an institution that accounts for diffuse policies to come up with a shared definition of what's good in this space? How would you do it? Like, what does that look like? Is it a five? And we can get down to the details of, like, is it a 5-member commission with tenure protection, right? Is it the judiciary? Is it something else, an ombudsman, some consortium, right? Is it industry? But what's the institution that does this the best?
I feel like that's super central to your work, Mary, so you should go for it. Not to deflect it to you, but it seems really core to your paper.
That's a great question. And T just asked that, and I grappled with it. And you're absolutely right. I was going to say, the minute you asked the first question, I was like, institutional design. And then you said it. And then, I'm not going to advertise any one of these things as the ideal approach, but I'm saying, like, I would say that we have from regulations telling us how to compose institutional review boards for medical research, to laws telling us how to compose police review boards, more from my area. We have rules about representation, about selection from a cross-section, because people are not going to agree. People are just not going to agree on these difficult questions. What you need is a process by which, even if you don't agree with the ultimate outcome, you respect the process. You respect the representation on the boards that reach the process. And so we already have models from various domains of law that grapple with controversial questions, potentially, that set forth, representation from a cross-section of the affected community. And I think in my particular case, where we're talking about private data, that cross-section should include public, but also private representatives, because there are multiple interests and stakeholders, and you need buy-in. So it's all about, it's about the reality, but also the perception of legitimacy, particularly in these contested areas. And representation matters.
Karen?
Yeah, I feel this question is, I think, literally keeping many people up at night, right? As we sort of start to reckon, particularly around AI, but it's really much more relevant to tech policy more broadly, right? I feel like the word participatory has become sort of this watchword of the way we should do things, right? That having the voices of having affected communities at the table is like the floor, right? But it still obviously doesn't resolve a lot of really difficult questions about how do we ensure that that isn't palliative or that it's not tokenistic, right? Or what does it mean to be representative? Who are we representing and what, along what axes? How do we decide what counts as that? And those are, at some point you enter this infinite loop, right? Where like the way you resolve those questions also might be resolved via some participatory process, and you just dissolve eventually, right? So those are really, really hard questions. And there's some really interesting, there's some work that I really like by scholars who are not me about kind of how to reckon with doing that in practice. I will say, I'll shout out the work of one of my PhD students, actually, Fernando Delgado, who's wrote a policy proposal for the Biden administration under the Day One project that's called, I might get the wording a little bit wrong, but it's called something like a community-centered agenda for AI innovation design or something, some of those words strung together in some order, which talks about kind of how the administration, how NSF and how federal funding might be best put to use to foster those types of community-led projects. And I think that seems like a good first step, right? Like it's not going to solve all these problems of how you decide, what communities are most relevant or how you resolve these differences in opinion or in values. But I think at least recognizing that maybe the way to answer these questions is through fostering, kind of community-led work rather than kind of the top-down model that we have for funding now, which is, largely kind of serving the agenda of market concentration.
Okay. I have one last question for both of you. Thanks for entertaining my off-scripted question. My last question, and then I'm going to turn to audience questions. So for the audience members, if you have questions, start to get them in now because we'll turn to those next. So both of you, what are you working on next? What's the next stage of the project besides the specific policy proposals and institutional design proposals? What's the next question that you want to tackle? Mary.
That is a dangerous question. You have an hour? I'm gonna give you the two immediate deliverables that I have to give like in the next few months. I'm working on an article and I'm looking under a book under contract with Stanford. The article is something that's inspired by the work of the center, actually, and dialogues that we've had together. And I'm actually looking forward to getting together in July to get your ideas on this work. And it's based on the collection and coding of private lawsuits as well as public regulatory agencies that are enforcing rights under two major privacy regimes, the GDPR, EU's GDPR, forgive me, the acronyms are so long, and California's CCPA, Consumer Privacy Act. But the study is basically asking whether the private attorney generals, the lawyers bringing these private lawsuits, whether they focus on enforcing different types of rights than public regulators. And it goes to some political theory behind private attorneys generals. The theory is that they're supposed to address some of the problems of relying just on regulatory bureaucracy like political capture and attention, et cetera. The question is it really borne out empirically? And also look at some mechanisms for aggregating claims and so forth. So that's the article. The book is something very different. It's born out of one of my passions, law and epidemiology. It's an ethnography of called Perilous Science. It's an ethnography of gun violence research, attempts to silence it, its resilience, its persistence under different regimes, and the lessons that we can take for pursuing politically unpopular or perilous science.
Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, that's super exciting. And Mary, I'm gonna get in touch with you and see if you want to come talk at Cornell about some of that work this fall, because I'm super excited about both of those, but the ethnographic project in particular sounds just fascinating. What am I doing? I still have kids at home during the pandemic, so a lot of my projects are like Legos at the moment, but academically, I'm finishing a book. I've been saying that I'm finishing this book for years, but I'm actually now very close to finishing the book. It's called Data Driven, and it's about privacy and surveillance in the long haul trucking industry. Data driven, get it? So this was my dissertation work at this point now, ages ago. I've been studying long haul truck drivers in the United States for actually like about a decade. And I have been looking at how electronic surveillance has been rolled out as part of the regulatory framework in that industry, what that has meant. It's an ethnographic piece too, right? So looking at how that has changed truckers' work, how it incentivizes different kinds of practices in the industry. More recently, kind of trying to shed light on the relationship between surveillance and automation, right? As automation starts to enter that industry, you know, in a really significant way over the last few years. And actually, in some ways, although I started that project a long time ago, it picks up, I think, on some of the themes that we've been discussing today, right? This idea that, you know, the way that different parties stand in these different power relationships to one another are all, you know, sort of lumped together, you know, when we think about the user of the technology, but in fact, the tech plays these really interesting and, you know, quite differentiated roles in mediating the relationships between, you know, workers and their employers, or between workers and the government. So that and Legos are my big projects for the summer.
Those all sound exciting, Mary and Karen. I hope that I have the chance to take a look at them and maybe moderate another conversation in the future about all of that. I'm going to turn to the audience questions now. Audience, I'm going to remind the audience once again that we have about 15 minutes, so I want to turn to as many of these as I can. I'll start with Ben's question, which is asking, so Ben asks, if we are able to move beyond sort of individually situated data governance, how would you define, I'm paraphrasing here, but I guess the question is, how do you define the relevant community for community control, right? So this is a good question. So how do we know what the graph looks like for the data, and how do we draw those lines?
And that's a great question. It's a hard question, right? Because community is a manufactured concept. But I think the answer kind of goes to the institutional design question about, we have these time-tested methods like for determining these squishy words like community and is it in the public interest and so forth. We kick the question over basically to a board that we feel like is legitimate and defines and weighs the balance of benefits and harms and identifies affected actors. Karen?
Yeah, it's obviously a great question. I think one really interesting thing that that we cite to in this article is some older work by Jonathan Simon about actuarial practices. And Simon makes this, I mean, he is obviously brilliant, makes lots of really great points, but one of the great points he makes in this piece is about the way in which actuarial decision-making reduces the capacity for social solidarity, because, you know, whereas before, you know, discrimination against people on the basis of some characteristic like gender, for example, is bad, right? But also facilitates social solidarity by folks who are discriminated against for belonging in that group, because you can recognize that you belong in that group together. If we start to, you know, make choices about people on the basis of similarities that are not socially salient, right? Like the browser that I use, or like the ads I happen to click on, you know, not only does that potentially still have these, you know, problematic uses where that information is used to discriminate against me in some way, but also it means like that I'm never going to develop solidarity with other people who fit in the same tranche as me, right? So the way we deal with that, I think, is really difficult. Tal Zarsky has, you know, raised the idea that maybe we should start recognizing classes of people on the basis of this sort of actuarial similarity. I'm not sure if I would go quite that far. I'm not sure it's, you know, like, I'm not sure I subscribe to that view, but it does raise this important point, right, which Virginia Eubanks also raises in some of her work, that to the extent that we do more and more of this online and we do it through predictive analytics, it becomes harder and harder to recognize what those group boundaries ought to be, right? Because we don't even see them ourselves, right? It's hard to say who belongs with whom. That's a total non-answer to the question, but it's all I have to contribute here.
Maybe a sort of a follow-up question to that, which is, what is it? And this is obviously a deep question, but right, so some of these decisions, or some of these some of the bounds are obviously socially salient for longstanding historical reasons, things like race and gender. And then there are ones that you alluded to are probably not, like whether or not I use Safari. Which ones are in the middle, and how do we how do these, right? So whether or not I use Safari may or may not be socially salient, sort of depending on whether or not you identify yourself as an Apple fan or not. Or right, and then that's both in the in-group and the out-group. So what is it that renders some of these groups socially salient over time? Yeah, I'll stop there because otherwise I have like 40 questions that'll pop up from that.
Yeah, I can say just briefly. So we talk about this in more detail in our paper, but for me, I think the important line is just, the history of marginalization that attends, treatment of different groups by race or religion or gender or disability. To me, that's a pretty important demarcation from Apple users or vegetarians or whatever it is, right? But to be sure, like that's still a pretty blunt division. And it may be, right, that there are these divisions in the middle that we might want to accord some protection, but to protect them under sort of the current way we think about anti-discrimination law feels to me like sort of a reach, right? Like that maybe that's not exactly the best tool for approaching those groups.
Yeah, we need an intermediate scrutiny. Okay, so I'm going to turn to Anne's question next. So Anne asks if we can expand on the analogies from environmental regimes that you think might apply to thinking about data and privacy externalities or dependencies. So Karen, I'll start with you and then to Mary.
Oh, sorry, to me, I thought you were going to Mary. So I was going to use that time to think more about the question.
Well, Mary, do you want to go first? Sorry, I didn't want to cut you off.
If you've got something ready, go for it, Mary. Otherwise,
your answers are so awesome. I'm like, whew. I would say it's a great question. In all seriousness, it's an excellent question. It's an important question. I think we can take lessons from common pool resources. Data. I mean, there's analogies. It's not a perfect fit, but there's, it's massed resources. It's not exhaustible, but it is a common pool, and the more people you allow to use it, the more the externalities, the harms that arise. Even if you're not exhausting the resource, you're creating privacy harms, for example, and secondary privacy harms and so forth, like ripple effects. And so I think we can draw insights from writers like writers who've puzzled over governance of these common pool resources, and again that lends insights to institutional design too. How do we govern these common pool resources? Karen.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think another kind of related place to look is to think about places where we socialize harm, right? Like market share liability, or like the way we compensate for vaccine injury, things like that, right? Like places where we've decided, rather than try to trace fault to a specific wrongdoer, right? We'll accept that there are going to be some harms that are just diffuse in nature, right? In the same way that environmental harms are often diffuse in nature. And then we will accept that maybe finding fault or establishing causation is maybe not ultimately going to get us where we need to go, right? And that if we socialize or we think about kind of insurance as a mechanism for doing something like this, that might, it's hard for me to think about what exactly an insurance market for privacy harm would look like. But I think but to me, those are interesting, models to start thinking with, right, in establishing policy here.
Okay, so this is the last question in the Q&A. So if you have a question, don't hold on to it. Otherwise, I have other things that I can ask, lots of other stuff. But this is a really concrete question. How would you draft an entity's privacy policy in order to account for both the sort of individual concerns that have traditionally been at the forefront of the way we think about privacy, including especially privacy policies, but also the sort of public good concern? And Karen, this time I really will start with you.
On purpose, okay. So I would say one way to think about it, there's some really lovely work by Meg Letta-Jones on the paper is called something like The Privacy of the Internet of Other People's Things, that's what it's called. Where there's some work by Alex Lipton, who was a law student at NYU, who wrote a student note about this, about how we think about kind of privacy protections for secondary users, right? And whether we might either through statute or just by writing privacy policies in different ways, start to think about whether if we can distinguish, for example, between the person who bought the device in a smart home and somebody who's just passing through, which we can do, right? Like we can figure out ways to do that technologically through speech recognition, through things that are already being integrated into the technology. We can ensure, for example, that, we're throwing away the data, that we're not using some of that data, right? Or that we're only using the data of folks who have actually, consented to use. Now that doesn't solve all of the problems because there are plenty of other problems associated even with notice and consent, but it gets us part of the way there. So that's not exactly, accounting for public benefit, but it's like, reducing the weight on the other side of the scale by reducing some of this, kind of dragnet gathering of data from whomever happens to be subject to it.
That's a great question. And I love the concreteness, because how do we move forward? And that's the ultimate question, right? And it's great to have, I'm seeing folks on the call who are from industry as well as academia who have the power to potentially help us move forward. And I think concretely, two ideas. First, I mean, one thing, just a basic thing that we'd love to see is access policy. Like, it shouldn't, you shouldn't have to do like a look on every tree to find potential access policies that vary from entity to entity. It would be great for if we could have a centralized place, transparent and clear provisions about how people can apply to access data, what the policies are, the procedures, the contact person, and what the company's policies are with respect to the access of data. That's one idea that I think there's a hunger for, there's a thirst for this. And then I think the second one, I actually don't know if I want to advance it as an idea. I'm still chewing over it. And here's why. So the second thing is, some folks have said, well, couldn't you, when you're asking for data, could you also ask data donators or consumers, do you wish to have your data pooled and amassed and released, perhaps even identifiably released for public, these defined purposes that are public benefit purposes, and then have them opt in. And and like remember the big controversy over tracking down a serial killer who using GEDmatch DNA data, and the big controversy, which I always tell my students, I get all these calls now about the fact that they caught a serial killer. What about the fact that you just realized that your dad wasn't your dad, your mom, etc. I never got calls back then. It's crazy what people, the visceral reactions that people get when like everyday privacy harms kind of go under the radar. But anyways, after that controversy, GEDmatch changed their policies. And when you upload your data, supposedly you have to elect whether to share that information to law enforcement or not. I don't want to get into the CrimPro stuff about how that's it's kind of just window dressing. But the bottom line is, so you could have opt-in policies. But I hesitate as to whether to recommend that, because I think that if you do that, where you have a norm where you have to affirmatively opt in, you are shrinking the pool of information, especially because who reads those notices? Who wants one more click box, etc. So I hesitate about that. So I have to chew over that some more.
I think we have time for one more. So actually, I'm going to react, Mary, to what you just said, and then I think we have to be done. So though I wish we could keep chatting. So this sort of this opt-in model reminds me a bit of Moore versus Regents of California, and the way, and so in Moore, there's a similar sort of question about there's information in the cells that can be used to develop some sort of therapeutic, and the approach that the Supreme Court of California takes is this sort of opt-in informed consent approach, where you don't have a property right in the data in your cell, in this genetic information, but you do have a right to informed consent. You have to opt in. And the opt-in approach ends up being not so effective. And so I'm interested to hear, I think, your reaction to that. And then Karen, for you, I'm interested to hear your reaction also to the opt-in approach, because I suspect that while the opt-in approach sort of protects it, to use the construct in your paper, it protects Alice, right, the one with the data, but it doesn't protect Bob, who is someone who can't exercise any control over Alice's decision to disclose, notwithstanding the fact that that decision to disclose affects Bob in some meaningful way. So Mary, why is opt-in still good or not good from more? And Karen, what should we think about? And then I think we'll be at time.
Great question. I'm not advocating opt-in. I have real issues with opt-in for the reasons that you discussed, the lessons of more. But also, I just think, our data is being used for like how to target goods for us, how to do all sorts of things. It's being used for profit making, and we don't opt in. Why would we? And then so it's kind of like it's setting up another barrier to opt in for beneficial purposes. So I have real issues actually with opt-in, but people often propose that and think, well, maybe there's some interest convergence here, because if you opt in affirmatively to donate your data for good, maybe also there's like a interest convergence with private companies who'll get more data because they can use it too. And so there's a big question mark for me. I'm not a huge fan of opt-in. Karen?
Yeah, I think I agree for the reasons that both of you stated, right? That, the effectiveness of opt-in, right, given that it's just another checkbox is in question. And I think ultimately, to just what you said, right, that it doesn't ultimately change that there's only one party getting to do the opting in, right? So that makes me think that probably a more effective strategy for protecting Bob, right, for protecting the person or the people, right, who are not in a position to actually consent, opt-in versus whether it's opt-in or opt-out, is instead more, centralized regulation on what data can be collected that isn't subject to, just to consent from Alice here.
Yeah, better. That's a great idea. Universal notice by changing our norms. So this is the norms around data use.
I think, so much of this, I think you're exactly right. So much of this ends up being about norms, exactly, about the way in which we, think about data as being held by us or held by other people, what data we're willing to pass on about ourselves, which is not to say that it's up to us entirely, right, or that there aren't dark patterns that are facilitating a lot of this stuff getting passed through. But yeah, I think that's exactly right.
So thank you both so much for this incredibly engaging and enlightening conversation. Thanks to CLTC for hosting us. I'm going to let you each have a minute to offer maybe some closing thoughts, and then I'll hand it back over to the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity. Karen.
I really have no final thought. I'm really grateful to get the chance to talk with you all. It's really nice to be able to do it in a casual way that doesn't involve PowerPoint. And yeah, it's always fun to get to see what's being cooked up at CLTC, and I'm grateful to all of you for spending some time together.
Exactly. I just want to say thank you. I mean, it's amazing that the folks that we meet, that the center facilitates these connections, and I'm grateful to you for coming, spending your lunch hour with us. And I'm super excited after reading Karen's work to be able to meet her, and Tejas and I to see all the amazing work that he's continued to do from the first time I ever met him, and he knows when that is. So thanks.
Let me give it back to Richmond.
Great. Thank you, Tejas, and thank you, Mary and Karen, for joining us today. That was a really exciting and thought-provoking conversation, and I wish we had another hour to hear you dive down those threads even more. And a huge thank you to the audience for being with us and asking really thoughtful questions. We appreciate your participation today. Before we close down, I also want to give a big thanks to our various CLTC supporters who help make events like this possible. And I'd also like to share a few ways that you can get in touch with CLTC and any of our panelists. You can follow us on Twitter or head to the CLTC website where you can sign up for our newsletter so you don't miss future events just like this one, and much more from CLTC. If you'd like to reach out to the panelists, they provided some information where you can contact them, and we'll leave this slide up for a minute in case folks want to jot down any information. But thank you again for joining us today, and stay tuned for more events and announcements from CLTC, and we'll see you next time. Thank you and take care.